Hi, everybody. It's Grandma Kate. This story might be for older kids, so Lily and Xavier and Eli and Faith, you might like this. Faith and Penny and Kobe, you may want to wait until you're a little bit older because I'm going to be reading a couple of chapters from Charlotte's Web today. One of my friends from college had made a comment on Facebook how she liked listening to the stories that I've been reading you. And I just love to read stories. It's one of my very favorite things that I did as a school teacher. And Charlotte's Web was my all-time favorite book to read to my first graders. I always read Charlotte's Web in the spring. And as you listen, if you've never heard this story before, you'll understand why, because Wilbur, the main character, was born in the spring. And this story goes through an entire year. It begins in the spring and it ends in the spring. And so this time of the year, I always love to share this story with my kids. And actually, this is the actual book that I read for, I think, like 20 years. And you can tell it is so well loved. The binding is broken and it has my original name sticker in there. You can tell how old this is. It's been taped up because it's been loved by hundreds of kids. And so I am just delighted to share it with you. A couple of minutes ago, Aditi jumped up on my lap, so she's going to be enjoying this with us today too. So I'm going to be reading a couple of chapters at a time. And that way there'll be like maybe 10-15 minutes. You can enjoy a little bit every day, or you can wait until I read the whole story and listen to it all at once, or whatever works best for you. So Charlotte's Web was written by a wonderful author named E.B. White, and the illustrations were done by Garth Williams. And I'll show you the pictures as we get to them. But if you have this book at home, just hit pause and then go grab it off the bookshelf and we'll read together. If you are just learning how to read, don't worry, you can just enjoy listening. I think sometimes listening is more fun than reading. And I think we all can learn how to be good listeners throughout our whole lives. So I'll enjoy reading this to you. Chapter 1 is called Before Breakfast. "Where's Papa going with that axe?" said Fern to her mother as they were setting the table for breakfast. "Out to the hog house," replied Mrs. Arable. "Some pigs were born last night." "I don't see why he needs an axe," continued Fern, who was only 8. "Well," said her mother, "one of the pigs is a runt. It is very small and weak, and it will never amount to anything, so your father has decided to do away with it." "Do away with it?" shrieked Fern. "You mean kill it? Just because it's smaller than the others?" Mrs. Arable put a pitcher of cream on the table. "Don't yell, Fern," she said. "Your father is right. The pig would probably die anyway." Fern pushed a chair out of the way and ran outdoors. The grass was wet and the earth smelled of springtime. Fern's sneakers were sopping by the time she caught up with her father. So what do you think sopping means? Like if her shoes were sopping, if the grass was wet. Maybe they were wet too because she ran through the grass. "Please don't kill it," Fern sobbed. "It's unfair." Mr. Arable stopped walking. "Fern," he said gently, "you will have to learn to control yourself." "Control myself?" yelled Fern. "This is a matter of life and death, and you talk about controlling myself?" Tears ran down her cheeks, and she took hold of the axe and tried to pull it out of her father's hand. You can see right there, she's pretty upset. I think I would be too. It's pretty brave to do that, I think. "Fern," said Mr. Arable, "I know more about raising a litter of pigs than you do. A weakling makes trouble. Now run along." "But it's unfair," cried Fern. "The pig couldn't help being born small, could it? If I had been very small at birth, would you have killed me?" Mr. Arable smiled. "Certainly not," he said, looking down at his daughter with love. "But this is different. A little girl is one thing, a little runty pig is another." "I see no difference," replied Fern, still hanging on to the axe. "This is the most terrible case of injustice I have ever heard of." Justice means like something isn't fair. A queer look came over John Arable's face. He seemed almost ready to cry himself. I think he has a tender heart. That means he has sympathy, or he feels what Fern is feeling. All right, he said, you go back to the house and I will bring the runt when I come in. I'll let you start it on a bottle like a baby, and then you will see what trouble a pig can be. When Mr. Arable returned to the house half an hour later, he carried a carton under his arm. Fern was upstairs changing her sneakers. The coffee table was set for breakfast, and the room smelled of coffee and bacon and damp plaster and wood smoke from the stove. Put it on her chair, said Mrs. Arable. Mr. Arable set the carton down at Fern's place, and then he walked to the sink and washed his hands and dried them on a roller towel. You all don't know what a roller towel is. This is from a long, long time ago, like in the 1950s. It was like this big, like paper towels, but it was cloth, and you would roll it down and a clean, dry place would come up, and then you'd use it up to the end, and then someone would wash it and then put it back up. So it's like reusable paper towels. But anyway, Fern came down the stairs. Her eyes were red from crying. As she approached her chair, the carton wobbled. It moved a little, and there was a scratching noise. Fern looked at her father, and then she lifted the lid of the carton. And there inside, looking up at her, was the newborn pig. It was a white one, and the morning light shone through its ears, turning them pink. He's yours, said Mr. Arable, saved from an untimely death, and may the good Lord forgive me for this foolishness. Fern couldn't take her eyes off the tiny pig. Oh, she whispered, oh, look at him. He's absolutely perfect. She closed the carton carefully. First she kissed her father, then she kissed her mother, and then she opened the lid again, lifted the pig out, and held it against her cheek. At this very moment, her brother Avery came in the room. Avery was 10. He was heavily armed with an air rifle in one hand, a wooden dagger in the other. And here's a picture of Avery. I often think, now that I know Papa, I'll bet you that's what Papa looked like maybe when he was a kid. He had a BB gun and a pretend knife. But I think Papa liked to go and explore in the woods and go out and do fun things by himself. So I often think of Avery like Papa when he was young. What's that? Avery demanded. What's Fern got? She's got a guest for breakfast, said Mrs. Arable. Now wash your hands and face, Avery. Let's see it, said Avery, setting his gun down. You call that miserable thing a pig? That's a fine specimen of a pig. It's no bigger than a white rat. Wash up and eat your breakfast, Avery, said his mother. The school bus will be along in half an hour. Can I have a pig too, Pop? Asked Avery. No, I only distribute pigs to early risers, said Mr. Arable. Fern was up at daylight, trying to rid the world of injustice, and as a result, she now has a pig. A small one, to be sure, but nevertheless a pig. It just shows what can happen if a person gets out of bed promptly. Now let's eat. But Fern couldn't eat until her pig had had a drink of milk. Mrs. Arable found a baby's nursing bottle and a rubber nipple. She poured warm milk into the bottle, fitted the nipple over the top, and handed it to Fern. Give him his breakfast, she said. A minute later, Fern was seated on the floor in the corner of the kitchen with her infant between her knees. Do you know what an infant is? Infant is another word for a baby. She was teaching it to suck from the bottle. The pig, although tiny, had a good appetite and caught on quickly. There's a picture of Fern feeding her little pig his breakfast. Isn't that sweet? I love that picture. You can tell by how she's gazing down at him, looking down at him. She loves him very much. Already. The school bus honked from the road. Run, commanded Mrs. Arable, taking the pig from Fern and slipping a donut into her hand. Avy grabbed his gun and another donut. The children ran out to the road and climbed into the bus. Fern took no notice of the others in the bus. She just sat and stared out of the window, thinking what a blissful world it was, and how lucky she was to have the entire charge of a pig. That means to be entire charge means to be in charge of or to take care of. By the time the bus reached school, Fern had named her pet, selecting the most beautiful name she could think of. Its name is Wilbur, she whispered to herself. She was still thinking about the pig when the teacher said, "Fern, what is the capital of Pennsylvania?" "Wilbur," replied Fern dreamily. The pupils giggled, and Fern blushed. It means her face turned red. I think she was embarrassed. Right. I'm going to read one more chapter, so if you need to take a break, just hit pause and then come back. But I'm going to read you a chapter called Wilbur, and then we'll be done for the day. Fern loved Wilbur more than anything. She loved to stroke him, to feed him, to put him to bed. Every morning, as soon as she got up, she warmed his milk, tied his bib on, and held the bottle for him. Every afternoon, when the school bus stopped in front of her house, she jumped out and ran to the kitchen to fix another bottle for him. She fed him again at supper time, and again just before going to bed. Mrs. Arable gave him a feeding around noontime each day when Fern was away at school. Wilbur loved his milk, and he was never happier than when Fern was warming up a bottle for him. He would stand and gaze up at her with adoring eyes. Do you know what adoring eyes are? I used to have a cat named Forrest, and he would look at me with adoring eyes, and he would look like this. He'd just look up, and sometimes kitties will do like blinky eyes at you, but I think if a pig looks up at you adoringly, it would probably be more of a, well, I don't know, practice adoring eyes right now. What would that look like? Like that maybe? I don't know. For the first few days of his life, Wilbur was allowed to live in a box near the stove in the kitchen. And then, when Mrs. Arable complained, he was moved to a bigger box in the woodshed. At 2 weeks of age, he was moved outdoors. It was apple blossom time, and the days were getting warmer. Mr. Arable fixed a small yard especially for Wilbur under an apple tree, and gave him a large wooden box full of straw with a doorway cut in it so he could walk in and out as he pleased. See, I'll show you a picture right here. There's a little one so you can see. There's his little box. He's going to go peek in there and see. Like apple blossom time would be about right now, even though it's weird, it's snowing today, but late April, early May is apple blossom time. So it would be about this time that Wilbur got his own little space outside. "Won't he be cold at night?" asked Fern. "No," said her father. "You watch and see what he does." Carrying a bottle of milk, Fern sat down under the apple tree inside the yard. Wilbur ran to her, and she held the bottle for him while he sucked. When he had finished the last drop, he grunted and walked sleepily into the box. Fern peered through the door. That means she peeked in. Wilbur was poking the straw with his snout. His snout is his nose. He crawled into the tunnel and disappeared from sight, completely covered with straw. Fern was enchanted. It relieved her mind to know that her baby would sleep covered up and would stay warm. If she was enchanted, that means she was very happy. Oh, this page is my favorite picture in the whole book. I'll show you in just a minute. Because I used to do this when I was little with my dog. Every morning after breakfast, Wilbur walked out to the road with Fern and waited with her till the bus came. She would wave goodbye to him, and he would stand and watch the bus until it vanished around a turn. While Fern was in school, Wilbur was shut up inside his yard. But as soon as she got home in the afternoon, she would take him out, and he would follow her around the place. If she went into the house, Wilbur went too. If she went upstairs, Wilbur would wait at the bottom step until she came down again. If she took her doll for a walk in the doll carriage, Wilbur followed along. Sometimes on these journeys, Wilbur would get tired, and Fern would pick him up and put him in the carriage alongside the doll. He liked this. And if he was very tired, he would close his eyes and go to sleep under the doll's blanket. He looked cute when his eyes were closed because his lashes were so long. The doll would close her eyes too, and Fern would wheel the carriage very slowly and smoothly so as not to wake her infants. I love that page. Isn't that sweet? You can see how Wilbur's looking up at her. I just love that. I think that's such a beautiful illustration. One warm afternoon, Fern and Avery put on bathing suits and went down to the brook for a swim. A brook is like a tiny little river. Wilbur tagged along at Fern's heels. When she waded into the brook, Wilbur waded in with her. He found the water quite cold, too cold for his liking. So while the children swam and played and splashed water at each other, Wilbur amused himself in the mud along the edge of the brook, where it was warm and moist and delightfully sticky and oozy. Every day was a happy day, and every night was peaceful. Wilbur was what farmers call a spring pig, which simply means that he was born in the springtime. When he was 5 weeks old, Mr. Arable said he was now big enough to sell and would have to be sold. Fern broke down and wept, and she cried. But her father was firm about it. Wilbur's appetite had increased, and he was beginning to eat scraps of food in addition to the milk. Mr. Arable was not willing to provide for him any longer. He had already sold Wilbur's 10 brothers and sisters. "He's got to go, Fern," he said. "You have had your fun raising a baby pig, but Wilbur is not a baby any longer, and he has got to be sold." "Call up the Zuckermans," suggested Mrs. Arable to Fern. "Your Uncle Homer sometimes raises a pig, and if Wilbur goes there to live, you can walk down the road and visit him as often as you like." "How much money should I ask for him?" Fern wanted to know. "Well," said her father, "he's a runt. Tell your Uncle Homer you've got a pig you'll sell for $6 and see what he says." It was soon arranged. Fern phoned and got her Aunt Edith, and her Aunt Edith hollered for Uncle Homer, and Uncle Homer ran in from the barn and talked to Fern. When he had heard that the price was only $6, he said he would buy the pig. Next day, Wilbur was taken from his home under the apple tree and went to live in a manure pile in the cellar of the Zuckerman's barn. And then tomorrow, I'm going to be reading a chapter called Escape. And this is a chapter about how Wilbur does not feel like he wants to be at the Zuckerman's barn. He tries to escape. And all the other animals in the barn encourage him or try to get him to do it. So I'll be reading a couple more chapters next time, but until then, have a wonderful afternoon. Grandma Kate loves you, and I'll see you soon.